Imagine you're climbing into a cockpit knowing full well that the jets hunting you can fly twice your speed, carry missiles that lock onto you from beyond visual range, and are flown by pilots with arguably the best training on the planet. You know this. Your commander knows this. Everyone on your side knows this, and yet you strap in anyway. That's not recklessness. That's not stupidity. That's something far more complicated and far more human. Today we're going to talk about a single morning in February 1994 over the hills of Bosnia, a morning that changed NATO forever and ended the lives of 3 volunteer pilots who flew obsolete jets into a sky that was never going to let them survive. But more than a war story, this is a study in what happens at the intersection of duty, technology, and the terrifying clarity of knowing you're outmatched and flying anyway. Because here's the question that almost nobody asks about this incident. What does it take to keep flying straight toward your target when you can already see the contrails of the jets that are about to kill you? To understand the morning of February 28, 1994, you have to understand the Bosnia of that era, a landscape that was simultaneously a diplomatic catastrophe and a live military theater. The Yugoslav wars had fractured the region into contested territories, and the violence on the ground was matched only by the paralysis in international boardrooms. NATO, for all its combined military might, had spent months watching and warning rather than acting. They had established a no-fly zone over Bosnia, a line drawn in the sky, but that line had been crossed before, and the response had been observation, not intervention. This matters enormously, because when 6 Bosnian Serb pilots climbed into their J-21 Jastreb jets that morning, they weren't operating on a theory. They were operating on lived experience. They had seen NATO watch. They had seen NATO shadow. They had heard the radio warnings, and crucially, they had flown home. The no-fly zone, from their operational perspective, had been more performance than prohibition. The Americans had Ferraris, and the Serbs had old Yugos, but so far the Ferraris had only showed up to rev their engines. That history, those previous missions where nothing happened, created a dangerous confidence. Not arrogance exactly, but a reasonable conclusion drawn from the available data. And in war, reasonable conclusions drawn from historical precedent have a disturbing habit of being catastrophically wrong the moment the situation changes. What the Serbian pilots didn't fully reckon with was that February 28th was different. The target was a weapons factory. The bombs would actually fall, and NATO's rules of engagement were about to shift from deterrence to consequence. Let's talk about the aircraft for a moment, because the technological gap here isn't just a footnote, it's the entire story. The J-21 Jastreb was a Yugoslav-designed light attack jet from the 1960s. It was built for ground attack, not air combat. It had no radar. It used optical sights, a pilot literally looking through a reticle and lining up a crosshair, the same fundamental principle as aiming a rifle. It carried unguided bombs. Its maximum speed was roughly 820 kilometers per hour. It was, by the standards of 1994, ancient. The F-16 Fighting Falcon, meanwhile, was one of the most capable multi-role fighters ever built. It could exceed twice the speed of sound. Its pilots had helmet-mounted cueing systems, radar that could track multiple targets simultaneously, and a weapons suite that included the AIM-120 AMRAAM, a radar-guided missile that could be fired from beyond visual range and guide itself to the target autonomously. The F-16 pilot didn't need to see the Jastreb to kill it. The missile would do the seeing. Here's what that gap means in practical terms. A J-21 pilot flying a combat mission in 1994 was in roughly the same position as a World War II fighter pilot who somehow ended up in a modern engagement. The skills, the training, the courage, all real. The machine, hopelessly outclassed. And yet, there's something the Jastreb pilots had that the technology gap couldn't erase: local knowledge. They flew low, below radar coverage, using the terrain, the valleys, the hills, the contours of a landscape they knew as a kind of analog stealth system. They weren't invisible to radar, but they were harder to track. And when the missiles came, that same terrain became their only hope of survival. That instinct, use the ground, hug the earth, make the machine do what the environment allows rather than what it was designed for, is one of the oldest principles in aerial warfare. And on that morning, it would save at least one life. Here's something that gets lost in the tactical analysis. The Serbian pilots completed their mission. They flew into a sky that had American fighter jets in it. They saw those jets make a high-speed pass, a visual warning, an implicit ultimatum, and then they kept flying toward their target. When the crosshairs drifted over the weapons factory, they released their bombs. They hit the target. From different approach angles, in pairs, they executed a coordinated strike under conditions of extraordinary psychological pressure. That's worth sitting with. Not as a moral statement about the war or whose side was right, that's a far more complex conversation, but as a study in human performance under stress. The composure required to focus on an objective when you know death is probably approaching is remarkable. The flight leader, Vukmirovic, reportedly heard the radio transmission warning of American aircraft ahead and made a conscious decision to press forward. That decision had a foundation. Prior missions had ended without engagement, but it also required him to set aside the fear that this time might be different. Compartmentalize the sight of F-16 contrails cutting through the morning sky and direct his flight to continue. That kind of disciplined focus, mission-oriented and controlled, appears throughout military history as one of the defining characteristics of effective combat pilots, regardless of the technology they're flying. The psychological training, the rehearsal, the mental conditioning to execute under fire, these aren't features you can upgrade with a new aircraft. They come from something deeper. The tragedy, of course, is that the mission's success triggered its own punishment. The moment the bombs fell, the rules of engagement changed. The F-16 pilots received the words, "weapons free," and what had been a warning became a hunt. What happened in the minutes after those bombs dropped is one of the most clinically efficient sequences in post-Cold War air combat history. And understanding how it unfolded tells us something important about the nature of modern warfare. The F-16s didn't attack chaotically. They worked methodically through the formation from rear to front, a standard tactic designed to eliminate the trailing aircraft before the lead aircraft even know they're under attack. The rear pilot has no visual warning because the missile is already inbound before the engagement registers. By the time the survivors scatter and start defensive maneuvering, the F-16s have already changed the odds. The weapons used tell the story of layered lethality. The first engagement used an AIM-120 AMRAAM, radar-guided, fire and forget, effective at beyond visual range. The pilot locks, fires, and the missile handles the rest. The pilot's job in that moment is to maintain the radar lock until the missile's own onboard radar takes over. Then he can already be thinking about his next shot. The AIM-9 Sidewinder, used in close-range engagements, is a heat seeker. It hunts the infrared signature of the jet engine exhaust. For a pilot flying a straight line trying to reach safety, the Sidewinder is almost impossibly hard to defeat without defensive countermeasures. You need flares, pyrotechnic decoys that burn hotter than the engine exhaust and seduce the missile away. The J-21s had no such systems. What saved Krnalich's life in that early engagement wasn't defensive electronics, it was terrain. The missile locked onto heat, he flew low, the electrical transmission wires crossed the flight path, and the explosion was close but not lethal. A fragment of his vertical stabilizer was torn away, his radio died. He was alone, damaged, and in a crippled aircraft with no way to communicate, but he was flying. The psychological dimension of that survival, knowing you've been hit, knowing your aircraft is compromised, not knowing if another missile is already in the air behind you, having no way to call for help or hear any reassurance, is almost impossible to fully imagine from the outside. 3 of the 6 pilots died that morning. Each death has its own texture. The first kill came cleanly, a missile strike that disintegrated a Jastreb mid-flight. From his wingman's perspective, it was an explosion, a shred of wing, a fireball. No warning, no time. One moment a pilot was flying. The next, he was gone. The second death unfolded over more time and more terror. Mitrović watched his wingman destroyed, then entered a desperate series of evasive maneuvers before the next missile found his engines. He managed to eject, and his parachute opened, and he survived. His wingman did not. The third death is perhaps the most haunting. Vukmirović, the flight leader, the man who made the call to press forward, who kept his pilots focused when they could see the American contrails, who held the formation through the bombing run, died trying to save what remained of his flight. He led his wingman Zaric into a low-level escape using terrain, turned them toward a cliff at maximum speed, and tried to use a pull-up maneuver to exploit the valley geography as cover. It was a last-ditch idea from a pilot who had run out of options. His jet clipped the ground. There was no parachute. Zaric, flying behind him, had just enough time to register the loss before he too was hit. He ejected. He was too low. The parachute didn't open in time. These aren't statistics. They're the endpoint of a chain that started with a mission briefing, moved through a political decision about a no-fly zone, ran through the judgment of a flight leader who assessed the risk as survivable, and ended in a fireball over Bosnian hills. What separates the survivors from the dead in this engagement isn't primarily skill or courage, it's geometry. Where they were in the formation, what terrain happened to be nearby, what angle the missile came from, whether the proximity of electrical wires happened to deflect an explosion by just enough meters. War at this level involves enormous skill and enormous randomness in almost equal measure.
The final scene of this story is the one that stays with you. Krnalić, in his damaged aircraft, sees the F-16 pull alongside him rather than taking position for a kill shot. He looks over at the enemy pilot. The American salutes him, a gesture that crosses every line of nationality, politics, and war, and then flies away. Why? Probably because the F-16 was at fuel limits and couldn't safely complete an engagement. That's the practical answer. But practical answers don't fully explain what that salute communicated. There's a long tradition in aerial combat of acknowledging the opponent's skill and survival. Krnalić was flying a destroyed aircraft home on what amounted to willpower and luck. He'd been hit by a missile and kept flying. He'd survived the valley chase. He'd navigated terrain that had killed his flight leader. The American pilot, whatever the fuel gauge said, took a moment to acknowledge that. Krnalić's own words offered years later carry enormous weight. I don't have any bad feelings toward the American pilots. We had our task, they had theirs. That kind of emotional clarity from someone who lost friends in that engagement and flew home in a damaged aircraft that should have been unflyable is either remarkable wisdom or the only psychological framework that allows a combat veteran to keep living without being consumed by what happened. Both, probably.
The Banja Luka incident was the first combat engagement in NATO's history, an alliance formed in 1949 that had existed for 45 years without firing a shot in anger, at least officially. That fact alone makes February 28, 1994, a genuine turning point in the history of international security architecture. Robert Wright, the F-16 pilot credited with 3 kills in a single mission, achieved the highest score by a U.S. Air Force pilot since the Korean War. The engagement demonstrated conclusively that the no-fly zone had teeth. Future violations of NATO airspace restrictions became far rarer, a deterrence effect born not from the existence of the rule, but from its enforcement. But here's what it didn't change. The ground war in Bosnia continued for another year and a half. The strategic logic of aerial dominance, the idea that controlling the sky translates directly into controlling the outcome, ran into the same friction it always runs into. Wars between peoples fought over land and identity don't end because one side loses air assets. They end through negotiation, exhaustion, and the slow grinding work of political settlement. The lesson that military planners have wrestled with ever since is that overwhelming technological superiority can make certain tactical outcomes nearly inevitable while leaving the strategic question entirely open. 6 men took off that morning. 3 came home. 1 flew home in an aircraft that had no business still being in the air and looked into the eyes of the pilot who almost killed him and received a salute instead of a missile. What we remember about days like February 28, 1994, matters. Not to relitigate whose cause was just. That's a conversation for historians and ethicists and the people who lived it. But to understand what human beings actually do when the technology, the politics, and the strategy collapse into the space of a cockpit, a decision, and a morning sky over Bosnia. They fly the mission. They protect their wingmen. They use the terrain. They find their way home if they can. And sometimes, across every line that divides them, they salute.